Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Working Rangelands Wednesdays, where we explore topics around rangeland agriculture in California and across the West. My name is Grace Woodmansey, and I'm a grad student at UC Davis.
My name is Dan Macon. I'm a Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension, serving Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties.
And I'm Leslie Roach, a UC Cooperative Extension Specialist in Rangeland Science and Management at the University of California, Davis.
So before we jump into our presentation, I just want to take care of a few housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted later on our UC Rangelands YouTube channel. And for our live webinar participants, we ask that you use either the chat feature or the Q&A pods to type your questions. We're going to keep an eye on those, and we'll save some time at the end of the hour for follow-up questions. So please do add your questions to either one of those spaces. So this week's webinar will be led by Cooperative Extension Advisor Tracy Shore, and we'll focus on using managed grazing to reduce fire fuels. And as all of you are aware, there's a lot of interest right now in this topic and using grazing as a tool to reduce wildfire risk throughout the West. But before that happens, there's a lot to consider in building a grazing plan that's the right fit for your community. So the goal of this presentation is to provide some information about how to start those conversations within your community about using grazing as a tool to manage fuels and wildfire risk. And we're excited to have a diverse panel of speakers today to share their perspectives on building a grazing plan. So first we have Peggy Moak, who's a rancher in Butte County, and Peggy is joining us by phone today. We also have Anthony Stornetta, who's both a rancher and the Air and Wildland Battalion Chief for Santa Barbara County Fire. And Kelly Jane Deanda is the Executive Director for the Butte County Fire Safe Council. And then of course, Tracy Shore is the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor for Plumas, Sierra, and Butte counties here in California. So at this time, I'll turn things over to Tracy.
Thank you, Grace, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us here today. So our conversation is going to be about grazing for fire prevention, and today's presentation is just the start of the conversation. So I'm going to kick off the webinar talking about some of the foundational principles of implementing a managed livestock grazing program to reduce fire fuel loads. Peggy is going to talk about the implementation with a case study. Anthony is going to follow up on the effectiveness of grazing as a management tool, and then Kelly's going to wrap it all together, bringing in the partners that are working in Butte County with the Butte County Fire Safe Council to use grazing as a management tool. As Grace said, my name is Tracy Shore, and I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor in Plumas, Sierra, and Butte counties. And today's webinar is supported with funds from the Renewable Resources Extension Act. As we go through the principles today, we're going to keep in mind what the fundamentals apply to both small and large parcels. Each site is unique and will have site-specific objectives. We're going to talk about what is managed grazing, what are some of the infrastructure considerations to using livestock grazing, what are some key considerations that you should take into account when you're developing a managed grazing program as you're implementing it and having adaptability, and what are some of those resources that are out there that can help you implement an effective livestock grazing management program for fire resiliency and the tools that are available. Just to recap, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to livestock grazing. And so this conversation here today is to help you think about how you could implement it on your personal home property or on an expansive landscape that you may manage as well or own. Prescribed grazing is the controlled implementation of the timing, frequency, and intensity of grazing to achieve specific goals. Today's conversation is about the specific goal of reducing fire fuel loads. In California, the typical livestock grazers are sheep, goats, and cattle. And the type of livestock you'll utilize to implement a managed grazing program to reduce fire fuel loads can be dependent on infrastructure, your size of your property, and the vegetation you want controlled. So when it comes to managing grazing, or managing vegetation with grazing, there are 6 key principles to consider. These should be discussed between a property owner and a manager. The first would be the type of livestock that you want to use, whether it be cattle, sheep, goats, or perhaps a mix. That can be dependent on your infrastructure, the size of the property, or your personal preference. And also the main goal, what type of vegetation you're trying to control. During last session of Working Rangelands Wednesday, there was a quote by a targeted grazer that talked about a lot of people may look at goats as their primary use for managed grazing, when in fact, the sheep may be better suited to eat that type of vegetation that was predominant on the landscape. So that's what the first principle is really thinking about the type of livestock and what the goals are for them the vegetation goals for them to consume. The second is looking at the number of livestock, the top stocking density. How many head do you need? The third would be the duration of grazing. So how long are they going to be on that property? And the fourth, that really has a lot of variables that come around it, is the seasonal timing of grazing. A lot of people start thinking about the use of grazing and the need to have animals about June 1st, when the vegetation starts drying out and the first fires start burning. It becomes really evident that they have a lot of vegetation, and so they want the livestock at that time. However, there are a lot of times when you can use livestock grazing throughout the season, or maybe it's a season-long approach depending on the place you're located. For example, some unique landscapes in the foothills have a reliable water source, so they're able to use grazing throughout the year, or on the Central Coast with cooler climates. There's also some benefits to the seasonal timing of grazing if you want to have other co-benefits that we're going to talk about a little bit later in today's first presentation, of other benefits that can come from the use of livestock grazing as a vegetation management tool. The fifth one is the frequency of grazing. If you're on a larger landscape, do you want the animal impact 1 or 2 times? Or if you're on a smaller parcel, it might be season long or 1 time only. As you get larger, you may have the option of creating pastures and cross fencing to have that impact multiple times throughout the season. And the sixth one is spatial distribution. This might not be a big impact or a factor if you are on a smaller parcel, but the larger the parcels you get, the more influence you'll have on where the livestock are grazing can be dependent on fencing, the water supply, as well as the vegetation type and which types of vegetation that the livestock are really actively wanting to eat, and what is the highest nutritional value for them. So before you start your grazing program, you want to make sure to have these 6 key principles outlined with both a collaborative conversation between the property owner and if you're bringing in an outside grazer, either as a tenant or a leasee or under contract, to make sure that it's clearly defined. We've talked about some of these earlier in this last slide, but really making sure you have the infrastructure to implement a managed grazing program. One of the first would be fencing. If you're using cattle, you would probably rely on permanent exterior fencing. However, with goats and sheep, you have some flexibility of using temporary electric fencing. There are also considerations for fencing as the larger parcel sizes you get to implement a rotational grazing system or to put heavier target and impact in certain areas. A second factor for infrastructure is drinking water. On a smaller parcel, you might be able to rely on your domestic well to provide water for this livestock. You'll also consider what is the naturally occurring ponds and streams on your parcel, or maybe investment in permanent livestock grazing water development, as you see pictured here with a water distribution system that is ran by solar. A third factor is supplemental feeding. This is important as you look at it from a season-long grazing standpoint. For example, when you hit drought or if there's freezes, the vegetation production may not meet what you had originally intended. So having the option of supplemental feeding. Shade and shelter can also be a factor, or if you're having lambing or kidding going on when they're on your property, of making sure you have the infrastructure available. And Peggy's going to talk about this from a goat perspective in her personal case example next. And then the last infrastructure consideration is about facilities. How are you going to load them? If there's an animal that needs veterinary care, how can you treat them on your parcel? So really the infrastructure can be dependent upon the parcel size and the livestock species that you're using for grazing. What are some other key considerations that you should take into account when you're developing a managed grazing program to reduce fire fuel loads is nutritional requirements. Then these can vary annually. Where are the livestock at in their breeding, gestation, lactation, or growth stages? How much nutrients and what is their uptake need to be? We talked about it in the last slide is, again, the supplemental feeding and how does that play under effect with drought and underestimates and having livestock there if you're having it year round. A third one is animal health, considering poisonous plants. Oftentimes livestock will avoid poisonous plants. However, when they're running short on feed, they may be enticed to eat those poisonous plants. And so taking those into consideration of what is on your property. Also thinking about their vaccinations and animal health care as part of that, and also predators, and making sure that if you're in a predator prone region that you have protection, especially with goats and sheep. The third one is plant requirements and plant health. What do the plants need to conduct critical functions such as photosynthesis and reproduction? You'll also want to have key consideration to mitigate potential negative impacts of animals on soil, erosion, riparian areas that can lead to water quality impairments. The next one is on emergency planning. As we're looking at implementing grazing as a management tool to prevent fires and reduce the spread of catastrophic fires, you also should take that into consideration. What is your emergency plan if you have livestock during fire season? What happens if you're in an area with PG&E shutoffs and you're well dependent and the livestock water rely on the well? Also comes in with freezes and floods that both can impact animal health and vegetation productivity. And the last key consideration is developing a lease, a contractor agreement if you're going to go out and not own your own livestock. And having that clear communication between a landowner and a grazing operator is paramount. When you're thinking about your managed grazing program to reduce fire fuel loads, you also have the opportunity to have a number of other co-benefits. And research has found that invasive species can be controlled with timing. For example, yellow star thistle. So if you're in the northern part of California or in the Sacramento Valley and the foothills, that key timing to reduce cover of star thistle could be in May through June, depending on the annual forage cycle and the weather patterns. Another one would be on brush management. Sometimes different brush species are more palatable to livestock at different seasonal times. A third one would be wildlife habitat. The use of managed grazing to reduce vegetative thatch and cover can promote habitat for raptors, burrowing owls, and grassland birds. And one of those reasons is so they can see their prey. Another benefit from burrowing owls is that because they're living in the ground, they can actually see and be prepared to escape from predators. Another wildlife habitat benefit could be from butterflies. The use of grazing to control non-native animals can promote native perennial plants that butterflies are attracted to, and the same with kit fox. Another benefit that can come from a managed grazing program is vernal pools. Much like the habitat for raptors, the use of grazing to control non-native animals promotes native plants that are endemic to vernal pools. And in that top picture with the cow, you see the cow has a mouthful of medusa head that's dry, a year old, as well as a vernal pool in the background. You can also support local foods and your local economy by supporting or implementing a managed grazing program. So there's a number of benefits that can come besides the fact of utilizing grazing to reduce fire fuel loads. So just wrapping this up are in our foundational principle sections that we are creating fire-resistant landscaping with livestock grazing. And we understand that livestock grazing is not fire-proof. The goal is to reduce fire fuel loads while balancing healthy land and healthy animals. If we take off too much cover, it can lead to bare ground, creating a prime opportunity for invasive weeds to flourish, counter to our mission. And you also want to make sure to leave cover to promote good grasses, forage, promote soil stabilization, and to prevent erosion. Reflecting back again on our seminar from last session of Working Rangelands Wednesdays, a targeted grazer had a really good quote that really sums up the mission of the use of grazing as a management tool to reduce fire fuel loads. And he said that no place that we graze won't burn when we are done. It will all carry a fire, but what we are doing with our grazing animals is changing the characteristics of that fire. And Anthony's going to talk about a little bit more about that later in the presentation. And just last here, there are a number of resources and partners in your local community and throughout the state that can help you implement a managed grazing program, whether it be the UC Rangelands staff, Leslie and her colleagues, the website that includes a number of different factors, especially there's a section even on invasive weeds there and drought preparedness. There's local cooperative extension advisors like myself and Dan Macon, who is a host of this webinar series, that are throughout the state that are a free technical service provided to you to reach out to you to answer questions and to provide you with technical resources. Many counties have resource conservation districts and natural resources conservation service staff that are in regional levels or county levels that have specialists in grazing management that can help answer your questions, as well as fire safe councils. Like Callie is on here later today and going to talk about the work that Butte County Fire Safe Council is doing using managed grazing. And lastly, some of the more creative options that you might be able to reach out to implement a grazing program is looking to the local FFA advisors, 4-H clubs that have livestock, your neighbor who may be implementing a grazing program. If you have a larger landscape, you may be interested in reaching out to local cattlemen's association or a farm bureau or the state wool growers association for contacts on targeted grazing and sheep and goat producers. So that wraps up our foundational principles for today and just the real basics of consideration for you to account for when you're looking at developing a new managed grazing program for a property that you may own or you're renting or a property you have land management control over. Our next presentation today is going to be on implementation with a case study. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Peggy Moak, a landowner in Butte County that lives in a fire-prone region in the foothills. She is going to share her family's story on successful fire preparedness using livestock grazing as a vegetation management tool with both cows and goats. Peggy, I am going to turn it over to you and I will share your presentation right now.
Super. Thank you, Tracy. Hey, thanks for the opportunity to share our grazing story with you today. My husband Pete and I have been long-term property owners in the Concow area. His family has maintained a 300-acre ranch over on the Big Bend side since the early 1900s, so he has a lot of experience with grazing animals. And my family's had a few animals over the years here, but hardly to the extent that we went into after the 2008 fire. So the Lightning Complex fire in 2008, next slide, burnt most of the land around our property. You might recall it was a pretty big fire, 60,000 acres and a couple hundred dwellings in the Concow area. If you look at the picture, our house is in the upper left-hand quadrant, and this is post-fire. You can see it's all pretty green and the trees are relatively untouched. The property all around it burnt pretty hard. It was a crown fire that came through with high winds. We stayed and defended our property. We were able to do so because of the defensible space that we maintained. But the lower left-hand quadrant is the property that we subsequently purchased. At the time of the 2008 fire, it was owned by someone else. Slide 3. So after the adjacent property owner logged and chipped the burnt forest on his land, we purchased 40 acres from him, and that was in 2011, with an eye to controlling our future wildfire vulnerability. So my husband worked really hard, clearing, cutting down brush, piling, burning. It took a couple, 3 years to get the property to a point where we could fence it. Number 4, slide. So we put goats on the land. We put perimeter fencing. Initially, we did about 10 acres using hog wire field fencing. And the reason for that is that we intended to initially put goats on the land. We expanded that fencing to 20 acres the next year, and ultimately we fenced the entire 40 acres. And these slides show my husband and grandkids picking up all the little sticks and cutting down the brush to make that a little more fire resistant in that area. Next slide. There's a lot of considerations when you look at using grazing around your property. First, as Tracy had mentioned, some of the costs and infrastructure needs. We put in field fencing initially because of the goats, even though ultimately we planned on having cattle and barbed wire fencing would have been adequate. But because it's such a long-term investment for fencing, we chose to go with field fencing for the entire property. You have to purchase hay in the winter and have a place to store it. You need shelters for your animals, salt licks, medications. When they have their babes, whether it's goat kids or calves, sometimes there's issues with the mother being able to feed, and you end up bottle feeding those little kids. And depending on the size of your property, you have to consider the flies and the goat droppings or the cow patties that might be around. So I would say not to have it too close to your house. One of the big concerns that we came up against was predation, and particularly for the goats. Goats, of course, are most susceptible when they're kids because they're so small. And the mama goats will actually take the kids out and have them lay down in the brush, and you cannot find those little devils. So it's actually easier for predators to get to them because they're so little. They might be hidden to us, but the predators have a way of finding them. Even worse than that, though, are the domestic dogs. We had a really unfortunate experience. In one night, we had 11 goats killed by a couple of domestic dogs that got in, and we were only able to get one of them. So that was pretty tough. Then we also had bears coming in, and they will damage your fence line. So one of the things you have to think about is periodically walking your fence line and making sure that there's not dog holes dug underneath, or trees that have fallen onto the fence and compromised it, or bears that have climbed over and compromised it. So all of those things are elements of taking care of the pasture land and the infrastructure. We also in the Concow area have coyotes, fox, mountain lion, lynx, and we don't have wolves yet, but for some folks that would be a concern. Now for cattle, overall they are less susceptible because of their size, and we ultimately decided to go to cattle in 2018. We went ahead and put 13 cattle on the property during that summer. Next slide. Yeah, so this is a picture of my hubby Pete with our little cottontail that he bottle fed, and then the cows that we have on the property now. We constructed the sheds and so on to house the goats and smaller fenced enclosures to contain the goats at night. And we had up to 35 goats, and at that time we would typically sell off the kids at auction and just keep the 10 or 12 adults through the winter and fed them hay. So once we decided to put the cows on in 2018, the workload decreased a little. In fact, it was pretty nice because it was one of our neighbors that had cattle in the area. And so he would come over and monitor and take care of that aspect of having the cows on. And then when wildfire strikes, and it did in 2018, the campfire hit us. I went outside and saw the smoke at about 10 to 7 in the morning, and by 7:30 we were fully engulfed. We were able, though, because of the defensible space that you can see out there, to get out with hoses, shovels, McLeod tools, and our tractor, and effectively manage that fire. As Tracy mentioned in her slide, everything burnt, all that grass that you see burnt. When the rains came about 10 days later, then we had beautiful green pasture again. Next slide. So this is an aerial view of Concow. On the right-hand side is a kind of eagle-eye view, and you can see, looking at it, that there are spots of green in the Concow Basin, and our property outlined in yellow really stopped the trees and so on from burning to the west of us. The fire came from the northeast, from Polga, and blew across. On the close-up, you can see that in that 40-acre quadrant, the upper part of it that looks a little bit greener and more bare of brush, that's what we had cleared pretty much totally prior to the fire happening. And then the lower half of that, you can see that there's quite a bit more brush and therefore more burning that happened in there. But a lot of this still survives. And to the left on your screen of our property, those trees that look kind of brown in there, they actually ended up greening up afterwards. You can see in the next slide. Yeah, so this is a picture I took just the other day, standing in the pasture area and looking off to that left-hand side of our property. So those conifers recovered, and the oaks are all regrowing, and the dogwood, things are really doing well on our property. And we were very happy that the reduced fire intensity from not having that fuel on the land saved not only the adjacent forested areas, but our home, our rental, my mother's home, and my sister's home. So it really kind of split the fire, and we were very, very pleased with the effectiveness of our grazing program. So in conclusion, we are big believers. Grazing for fuel reduction and wildfire mitigation is cost-effective, and most importantly, it's self-sustaining. And if anyone has any questions, I will be available during the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy, very much for sharing your personal family story about fire preparedness. This is a great case example of multi-species grazing and site-specific conditions, along with personal preferences that we talked about in the first presentation. This case example highlights the practical use of grazing to reduce fire fuels and the importance of adaptability. Thanks again. Our next speaker is Anthony Stornetta. Anthony is a cattle rancher on the Central Coast, along with the Air and Wildlife Battalion Chief for Santa Barbara County. He is going to talk about the effectiveness of livestock grazing as a vegetation management tool from the perspective of a firefighter on the ground, and also from a strategic planning perspective of leadership during fires and for fire prevention. Anthony?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Let me turn on the radio. I knew this would happen right when I started speaking. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to briefly summarize, the successes and challenges to firefighting in grazing lands and ungrazed lands. And again, like Peggy stated, I'll answer some questions at the end if you have any. But I'm going to cover some terms that we deal with in the fire service. And to some of you guys that are local ranchers and UC Cooperative and ARCS, you'll understand these terms. But I'll just briefly cover those. And the benefits of grazing to the firefighting and the forces on the ground is it allows us to do direct fire attack. And what that means, it minimizes the amount of loss of acreage that the ranchers or the farmers sustain over the fire itself. And that's income. That's, as a beef producer, that's income to all of us. So we want to save much grass as possible. If you have grazed land, what that means to us is it means less heat to our firefighters, escape routes, and it leads to eventually to smaller fires because we can get in there and attack those fires directly. What it also provides is access and egress. And from a few different standpoints, access egress pertains to both the firefighters getting in there and out of there. Also the residents and the homeowners, it provides access and safe egress in the emergency as well. But also livestock. It allows livestock to get to a point where they can sustain the fire. A perfect example is 2018 during the Sonoma fires. I spent 31 days up there, and there was a group of cows on the Safari West Ranch. They're all Watusi cows, pretty nice. And I remember looking at those one night, trying to plug in some dozer lines and thinking if they stayed in that spot, they'd make it. Well, 48 hours later, they were a little singed, but they all survived. So great success stories out. There's many stories like that where the benefits of grazed lands has saved the livestock, the residents have got out, and it's done wildland, urban space, and defensible space. CAL FIRE preaches this a lot, and many of our jurisdictions, such as us, also utilize that defensible space. And under that defensible spaces, we can't save your homes, your equipment, your haystacks. We can't get in there and save all that unless we have that space to work with. And when we talk about grazed lands and perimeter control is actually fighting the fire. When we have to provide structure protection and protect your structures, we can't do that perimeter control, so the fire gets out of hand and gets larger. So with the grazed lands, it allows that opportunity to protect the structures, and usually that fire will stay in check. Also, you need to realize that in ungrazed lands, that we can only fight, firefighters on the ground can fight about 8 to 10 foot flame lengths. Other than that, it's heavy equipment and aircraft. So that poses some hazards to firefighters as well. So again, another pro for grazed lands. So if we look at the challenges now to the ungrazed areas, there's a few different terms I want to throw out there. Is probability of ignition. So if we have grazed lands and we get an ember embers can fly, or spot fires can start up to a mile ahead of the fire. So if it's got receptacle fuel beds with a lot of grass, that fire is going to take and move on. Probably ignition in grazed lands is much less. It may start, but it'll just punk around and kind of skunk around, not really going there. So an advantage to graze over ungrazed. Spread component, again, the heavier fuel beds and fuel loading, it'll take up and just take off on us without any chance of stopping it. The ladder fuels kind of goes back to Peggy's presentation. In grazed lands, a big component is we want to keep it out of the timber. So if you're grazing your lands and providing that buffer from the ground to the lowest limb on your oak trees, your pines, your firs, whatever it may be, it keeps it out of the timber, because once it gets in the timber, we have, like Peggy stated again, those crown runs where it's almost unstoppable, even by aircraft at that point. So we lose a lot of latitude for firefighting. Those ladder fuels are big to try stopping it as well. And just so you guys know, our priorities from the fire districts and things like that is we usually follow life, property, environment. So number one is getting everyone out, and in the grazed lands, it's easier to do that. The property, we know on ranches and farms, it's very dynamic because there's so many outbuildings, and again, protecting the haystacks and the structures. It gets a little cumbersome to do all that. So the values at risk are just that. Life, property, the environment is usually the rule we follow. I would say along those ungrazed areas, something I want to make sure I capture with all of you is there's been many fires that have happened in our areas, and we can all look back on those fires, but think about how many times we had missed opportunity where it burned through some heavy fuel beds like brush and sage, and we didn't go back in there and graze it to keep it down. Those are missed opportunities, I think, because a fire comes through there, we need to come back and graze that land as soon as possible. After we get some regrowth, and we don't want soil erosion, but we want to take advantage of those right there. So lastly going on is we talk about resources and partnerships, and Tracy kind of hit on this as well. Some of the places that we look for, and from the beef producer side and also the fire services, the NRCS looking at grants for cross fencing and looking at them putting in watering facilities. This is also doing for Fire Safe Council. Sometimes they'll partner in fire districts with watering facilities. The Fire Safe Council, they participate in a lot of grant funding. They can do fuel treatments. They can collect data. UC Cooperative Extension can do partnerships as well. The local fire districts as well can come out. They can survey your area, give you some pointers, some tips, work with them. And developing that trust in those relationships, I preach this to everyone, is once you develop relationships and trust, you can kind of do anything. And the other thing it gives fire districts is an advantage to see your land, where your access routes are, and then where they can put in fuel breaks and things like that for fires. And lastly, I can't do this without making a plug for the California Cattlemen's Association. Under President Mark Lacey, he was very aggressive, and it started with Dave Daly when he was in there, in getting the fire subcommittee going. Being part of that committee, led by Tony Toso, who's very active and pushes us a lot, is there's a lot of things like ranchers handbooks that are coming down the line. The partnerships with PBAs, Prescribed Burn Associations, Range Improvement Associations, and working with Prescribed Fire. All those partnerships are from the cattlemen's to the local UC Cooperative, the NRCS, and then back down to your fire districts as well. So I think those relationships and partnerships are very important, and I want to make sure I encourage all of you guys to get out and make those notifications. That kind of sums it up on my side of the firefighting side of it, and I'll gladly answer any questions. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Anthony, for sharing your unique perspective that brings together both a ranching background and a firefighting background. Summing it up as, livestock grazing is one tool that can be used to manage fire fuel loads. And really, thank you for sharing the values that you see from a firefighting perspective of how managed grazing can help you get a leg hold in the value of partnerships and relationships, and utilizing those resources that are available for landowners to implement a managed grazing program and to implement defensible space and other activities on their land to become more fire resilient. So I am going to turn it over now to our last presenter, which is Callie Jane with the Butte County Fire Safe Council. And Callie's going to share a little bit about the work of the Fire Safe Council, give you some insight of past projects using livestock grazing to reduce fire fuel loads, recognizing the value as one tool, and some current projects that they have underway post-Camp Fire, and their vision for moving forward with grazing as a key vegetation management tool in the county. Callie?
Great. Thanks so much, Tracy. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to share with you today. We, as the Butte County Fire Safe Council, serve our region in a wide variety of fire safe education and mitigation projects. And about 4 years ago, we began looking into how we could incorporate some grazing into these projects, which we typically do hand cut pile chip or hand cut pile burn or at times mastication. And so one of the first projects we had was a pilot in the area of Forbstown, which is somewhat more of a conifer forest, and we had done fields reduction there and brought the goats through a very small area just to see what they would eat. And unfortunately, they did select some pine trees, which was not what we wanted them to eat. From there, we had the goats move on to a partner project on Department of Water Resource land, which is in a recreation area around Lake Oroville. And that area was mostly a blue oak grass woodland with a nice understory of grass. The area had been treated prior with CAL FIRE conservation crews with piling and burning. The campfire came through the area, and then we were able to graze it after that. And the interesting thing with that was there was a small portion of Scotch broom in which the goats ate the tops off. They didn't eat the whole plant, but they ate the tops. And that was beneficial because that helped prevent the amount of seeding in the next year. And so we're really happy with the way that project unfolded. And we also got to witness Yankee Hill Fire Safe Council doing a project around Lake Concow on the irrigation district land there, in which they had shared a lesson learned in that when the Scotch broom was cut with a brush blade or weed eater ahead of time, the goats were more interested in eating it in a dried state than the standing live vegetative state. So those are projects that we've directly been involved in recently. What we're looking to do currently is have about 400 acres of grazing in the campfire footprint, somewhere within the town of Paradise or on the Ridge region. And what we were hoping to do is work with the town officials and adjacent large landowners to look for areas that we could ideally create a long-term grazing plan that we would rotate the animals through every 3 years. And so that's really at the beginning of a new process. 400 acres isn't a lot, but we do have some herds folks starting up in that region on their own herds and others in the Northern California area that we'll be drawing upon and getting advice. And so what we're looking to do moving forward is pull together the multiple resources that Tracy and the others have talked about so far, our Natural Resource Conservation Service, our Resource Conservation District, our CAL FIRE partners, and others, to look at a committee that really can bring together the dialogue and look and address some of the challenges, especially how do we get funding for fencing and what are the right type of animals in the right locations. Ideally, we would have an overlay, perhaps even in our general plan, I could dream of a desired grazing areas and amount of acreage we would wish we could treat per year if we want to stay ahead of the trend of catastrophic wildfires in our area. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Callie, for that overview of the work that you have going on in Butte County and your vision for the future. I'm going to turn it back over to Grace and my colleagues now for the question and answer session. Grace.
Okay, thanks to everyone, and thank you, Tracy. So I know, Anthony, you've got a busy schedule today, so I think I'm going to start with a question about CAL FIRE prevention grants. And if there are any examples for supporting treatments with those type of grants where, you know, grazing can be used as a follow-up treatment in addition to other fire fuel management tools.
The only ones I know of right now is I know just the local ones, San Luis County, Santa Barbara County, Monterey, just in our area that received them. And some of the stuff we received them for is fuel treatments, like mastication, doing some joint and range improvement type burns and prescribed fire. And we're not really doing type conversion, but we're just restoring the natural vegetation. When I talk about defensible space, and I think Callie mentioned is we didn't burn for so long that all this vegetation got so high and out of control that it's hard to get it back to the natural vegetation. That's what we want to do in some of these places for defensible space. But some of the other counties I know are also doing some data studies about alternatives as well, and then just some range improvement grants as well. Mostly just fuel treatment. It's kind of the ones I know of. I'm sure there's other ones throughout the state. Those are just the local ones I know.
Okay,
Grace, I might just add real briefly, here in the foothills, we're seeing a lot of our utility ground being mechanically treated initially, and then livestock being brought in to do that kind of follow-up treatment. It's tough to control 10 foot of manzanita with a goat, but when it starts to resprout, we can have some pretty good impact on it using livestock as well.
Well, I think that kind of leads us nicely into this this next topic that's been brought up a couple different times. So we've had a few questions about trade-offs with managed grazing and non-target impacts on the landscape. Tracy, I think this speaks a little bit to your point about managing for fire resilient landscape, not necessarily a fireproof landscape, but I'm wondering if Leslie, Dan, and Tracy can weigh in and talk about how to develop a plan that manages takes those trade-offs and non-target impacts into account.
So I can start off. I think, taking this from a practical on the ground landscape, I think, one of the first things that from a production standpoint, when I go out as a producer, or I go out with producers that are clientele with UC Cooperative Extension, is one, looking at the landscape and going back to those principles we talked about in the presentation of what are those key considerations. And I think with any activity that you have for fire resilience, you're going to have trade-offs with that activity, whether it be prescribed fire that Anthony mentioned, or targeted grazing, the theme of the workshop, or some of the other practices that Fire Safe Council and CAL FIRE uses. All of those have an impact. And I think, the reality is of California, it has been invaded with non-annual grasses for a number of years. And, we found that livestock grazing is one tool that can manage those. And so I think it gets back to those principles of one of, doing a site assessment and recognizing what are those critical resources. Are there riparian areas? Are there native plant populations? Are there sensitive and threatened and endangered species? And when you're designing your program, thinking about where your livestock watering sources are, where your cross fencing might be implemented on a larger landscape, where you're putting nutritional supplements, whether it be salt or protein supplements, and so forth. So Leslie and Dan, do you want to expand upon maybe some of those principles as well, and how you've worked with clientele in the field to help address those unintended consequences of a managed grazing program?
You want to take it first, Dan?
Sure. I think one of the things that's important to remember, maybe grazing treatment is a misnomer. I think when we talk about grazing, it's kind of a systematic approach to dealing with these issues. And so because it's systematic, we can have multiple goals and multiple benefits to that grazing program. To give you an example, we may have areas where we want to conserve fall feed to come back to with a producer. That's probably not the area where we want to be most concerned about providing greater fire protection for a community. And so thinking strategically about where we apply that system on the landscape is part of that consideration. But we can also use grazing to have multiple benefits in addition to fuel reduction. Things like addressing weed infestations, yellow star thistle or medusa head, for example, can be addressed with appropriate timing, duration, and intensity of grazing. And so I think looking at that bigger picture is part of the equation in using this tool as well. Leslie?
I think I was also looking at some of the questions here, and Tracy touched on it quite a bit, but thinking about mitigating the, potential negative impacts and thinking about what are the sort of net benefits from any tool that you use. And obviously our focus here today is using, grazing management as a tool, but, thinking in general, not just from a fuel load perspective, but also thinking in terms of weed management and vegetation management, thinking about an integrated management program. And actually, our group has been doing some work in that, led by Julia Shaw, who's a PhD student in the graduate group in ecology, really interested, asking some questions, and I just happen to have this picture of her research behind me, but asking some really interesting questions about combining different tools, including grazing but also prescribed fire and native seeding to manage some of these landscapes. And obviously, these all have their benefits and risks and management challenges. Native seeding is very expensive, and so but there's some really interesting questions about how we can combine different tools, including grazing, seeding, and prescribed fire to manage the vegetation on the landscape. And one of those questions is, how do we create a more resilient landscape, with fire being one of those major challenges? So that's one thing I wanted to bring up because I see there's a lot of interest in that in the question. But I think it's a good point to think about, what are the tools available? What can folks use? What is feasible and, logistically on the ground? And what do we know from a, science perspective, research perspective of what are the potential risks, benefits and net outcomes of these different practices?
Leslie, if you don't mind, let me just a little input is when we go out and meet with some of these local ranchers and everything, the first thing we ask is what's your goal or what's your end state look like? And just like you touched about, Leslie, is maybe it's not mechanized, maybe it's fire, maybe it's not fire, maybe it's mechanized or just grazing. But that's the first thing we want to say is what's your end state? Where do you want to go? And maybe, Dan, like you mentioned, it could be the invasive species. I'm glad you brought that up because it's different for every person and every plant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anthony, I've got another question for you, and this has been a challenge in our part of the foothills to some extent. How can the ranching community reach out to our fire professionals, both in terms of kind of this upfront work, but then also working together in an emergency? What are some things that we can do to be of help to the fire service?
I would say one of the biggest things I kind of mentioned earlier is building those relationships up front. And some of the bigger parcels of the ranches and farms in your area is go to your local fire station. It may be a big CAL FIRE unit or like us, a big district, and go talk to that local fire station, get them involved and have them come out to your ranches and, just review your access roads. Because I didn't mention earlier, but if you have grazed land or good access road, that gives us good points to fire off of or start our hose lines and things like that. And if we don't know those access points, it takes a lot of time to start figuring that out and developing a plan. Whereas if we built that relationship ahead of time, we could do it. So I think that'd be the first one, is talking to them. And most units have a vegetation management officer or like myself that goes out and looks at different ranches and looks at the goals and what kind of landscape they want to change it to, and building that relationship to that next level with the foresters and things like that. And with Senate Bill 1260 and a couple others, there's been a lot of relaxation in some of these obstacles we've been trying to overcome. So I think working with them, and there's a lot of different avenues that are available to us now. It takes time with some of these new bills. That timeline's been shortened and it's been streamlined, and it's time to take advantage of it. So yeah, get out and start talking to them. I know there's some frustration out there, and there's frustration on our side in the past. And believe me, we're all in this together. But I think moving forward, there's a pretty good slate to work from.
So we've got another question here for all of our panelists, kind of about building resilience across a community and working with multiple stakeholders and agencies to make that happen. So since you're all kind of representing a different stakeholder group here that's trying to accomplish the same goal, what has been a good resource for you just in learning about grazing for fuel management or getting grazing implemented as a fire mitigation tool? Like, where have you started?
So I can maybe kick this off and then turn it over to Callie and Peggy to talk about it. But post Camp Fire, there have been lots of discussions in Paradise community with homeowners and landowners and different agencies. But I think one of the ones that really showcases it together is our recognition of each other's skill sets and where we came in. And so one unique example is Callie actually connected the vegetation management program chief in Butte County with CAL FIRE, Gus and I, to go actually meet with a landowner who has a large extensive landscape about the use of grazing as a management tool. And so they had been and we're still working with them on those conversations, but I think, you know, really putting people together to have that conversation. And so the Fire Safe Council had recognized the landscape was a fire prone area and at risk to communities. CAL FIRE had recognized it as a threat to their firefighting capabilities, and then called in Cooperative Extension and went out with CAL FIRE to go talk with them. So I think it's really leveraging those resources and partnerships to help a landowner or a property manager feel confident when they're implementing a grazing management program that they're taking in those risks and benefits that both Leslie and I and Dan had mentioned in the conversation about embarking on a grazing program. So Callie, I don't know if you want to follow up on maybe some more of those partnerships that you guys have worked on and the new grazing operations that are underway in Paradise out of the recognized need for grazing as a management tool up there.
Okay, super. Thanks so much, Tracy. Well, the Butte County Fire Safe Council's board of directors is designed to be collaborative, and so we represent 17 different community members, agencies, and stakeholders. And so I bring that up because really that's the key to moving forward with grazing, as with the myriad of other issues involved with preparing our communities for wildfire. So our primary goal is to create a bridge between the agencies who have the skills and the strength and the landowners who have a desire to cooperate or who may just be unaware of the opportunities and potential on their land. Ideally, there would be more support funding for all of these things, but in the short term, it's about creating a culture of consciousness that grazing is a needed tool, and that so we can link one by one landowners with resources and agencies with support will get closer to the goal of making our communities more fire resilient. So that's a vague way of saying it's all about partnerships. It's all about meeting the needs of the individual landowners. And we as the Fire Council are there to be that bridge and carry those dialogues through and help everybody the best we can to get to the end goal.
Anthony and Peggy, anything to add?
My conversation probably has more to do with the comment on the native grass and weed issue. Did you want to get into that now, or?
I think we have a few other questions later that might address that topic. So maybe we'll stick to the current question. We can jump back to that in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I would just say is I concur with what Callie said. That's exactly those partnerships. I mean, re-emphasize that over and over. And Fire Safe Council has been a great avenue for obtaining those grants and work with. And the Fire Safe Council is usually a diverse range of people anyway. It's got the ranching community, the farming community, it's got the fire community. I mean, it's got a lot of different panelists on there that all work together. So that partnership works. And Fire Safe Council is a great place or a great avenue.
Grace, just one more question that came up in the Q&A regarding, you know, kind of the trade-off between grazing for fuel breaks versus providing wildlife habitat benefits. And I think it's important to go back to one of the points that Tracy made, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago as well, that grazing really modifies fire behavior and fuel profiles. It's not a terribly effective tool at creating a fire line or a, you know, grazing down to the soil surface. It's not something that producers want to do, and nor is it necessarily appropriate from a range perspective. But it allows us to modify that fuel behavior. And Anthony, you talked about it as well, that it gives us, as opposed to being a place where the fire goes out. I think that's an important distinction to make.
Okay. Well, since we're nearing the end of the hour, I think I'll go ahead and kind of wrap things up here. Thank you to everyone for a great discussion about how to get these conversations started on using grazing as a tool to reduce fire fuels. We hope that this has helped to identify some tools and strategies that can be useful in your communities. And I've seen some questions about resources, so we'll make sure to follow up with an email that connects folks to some additional resources if you'd like them. This recorded webinar will be posted on our Working Rangelands Wednesdays YouTube channel, and that information will be in a follow-up email as well. So thank you again to our panelists for participating and to Tracy Shore for leading today's discussion. Just in terms of Working Rangelands Wednesdays and kind of our upcoming schedule, today's presentation marks the end of kind of our summer series. So we'll be taking a brief break over the next few months, but we'll be back in late fall with kind of a second season to continue to discuss topics around rangeland agriculture in California and across the West. So thank you so much to all of you for your participation and support, and we'll look forward to seeing you this fall.